Hello and welcome to Counterculture. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, over the past few weeks we seem to have gone a very, very far distance in a very short space of time. From the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis right through to statues being toppled and TV shows cancelled. No wonder many people seem extremely bewildered and indeed angry. And indeed there seems to have been absolutely no pushback from any quarter. So what exactly is going on? With me to discuss this, I'm very pleased to say we have Claire Fox, who is a director of the Academy of Ideas and of course a former Brexit Party MEP, Emma Webb from the Civitas think tank, and the New Culture Forum's Rafe Hadelmanku, historian and commentator. I want to start with you, if I may, Emma. On my way here today, as we've seen in all the pictures, the statue of Winston Churchill was completely boarded over. What are your sort of feelings when you see that?
I think it's a symbol of extraordinary failure. The fact that the police have shown themselves to be incapable of defending our monuments. I was actually there when they defaced the statue on Sunday and stood next to the police whilst they sort of haplessly looked on while people were chanting awful, vulgar things and spray painting Churchill as a racist on the statue. And as well, I think in the end, they'd also, the Antifa symbol had also been spray painted on the side of it. I think what it shows is that not only the police, I think the police officers themselves, so many of them were injured, that they've actually been failed by the leadership, by Cressida Dick, and also by the statement that Neil Basu put out as well over the last couple of days. And just generally, the leadership from the government has been so weak that now we have no talk of the influence of the far left hijacking these protests, but the people who are actually coming out to protect our monuments are being described by the Mayor of London as being far right, when all he has done is legitimise the iconoclasm and the criminal damage that's been taking place, not just on monuments that are connected to slavery, but people like Robert Peel, who founded the police force, and actually are responsible for us having community policing and disarmed police. So I think it's outrageous, and a lot of people are going to be very, very angry to see that.
Claire, do you see a sense of failure there too, like Emma?
Well, I mean, it does appear to have given what the people who want the statues removed, given them what they want, because you now can't see them. I mean, covering up, pulling them down and so on. I think that Emma's right, although I actually think that the police themselves, I mean, leadership, you might say, but nonetheless, there has been a fair degree of collusion and agreement by senior police chiefs about standing by and letting this happen, as we saw from the interview with the head of Somerset and Avon Police, Essex Police have come out and so on, which is that there is a sense in which they believe that there's something righteous about what's happening on these demonstrations. I don't think it's even that they're fearful. I mean, if they are fearful, that's problematic. But, sometimes it's presented as though it's the yobbery of the protesters, whereas actually, I do think that if you abdicate responsibility and let people, I mean, almost in a way, it's like a kind of incitement. If you kind of stand back and say, well, what can we do? Then it actually encourages people potentially to do things that they wouldn't have done. I mean, it's got a kind of endorsement side to it. And I think that we've generally seen, as Peter, you indicated in your introduction, that this is not about, this is kicking an open door. So many institutions from the top have been prepared to metaphorically take the knee. And this has become far removed from what was a completely legitimate and genuine outrage at the brutal police killing of a black man in America. And then people wanting to show solidarity, maybe saying that there are issues of racism in the UK they wanted to take on. But at this point, we've almost become so far removed from that it does a great disservice to anti-racism that this is the censorious outcome, with an institutional leadership that's, you know, on its knees, sadly.
Yes, Rafe, Emma alluded there to Neil Basu and what he said. I mean, are you familiar with what when he came out and basically said, you know, that we're institutionally racist? This was, he used the Met Police account actually to make this announcement, and you know, it was, I think, quite extraordinary coming from a chief of police. Would you? You're obviously very involved in statues, actually, in a way, aren't you, and commemoration. You know, do you sort of see this as a cultural assault?
That's exactly what it is. And far from having a state that's institutionally racist, what we have is a situation where you have an institutional acquiescence in that cultural onslaught. And that can't be stressed too highly enough. Now, I've been a member of the International Churchill Society since the age of 14 and served on its board of directors. So for me, Churchill, someone who's of Polish and Sikh Indian ancestry, Churchill has always been a great inspiration to me, and I've had no qualms at all coming to terms with what were views held by any contemporary Victorian of that era. But what we're basically seeing from the police are statements that Britain is a racist country, when we know full well from every global survey that's been done in terms of racial tolerance, in terms of who the average person will have living next to them, Britain and those former British colonies, Canada, Australia and New Zealand, are among the least racist countries in the world, far more tolerant than you'll see on the continent of Europe, for example, along with Latin America, another racially diverse region of the world. Those are the two most racially tolerant parts of the planet, and yet here we are trying to be sold this line that we are living in a racist country, which simply holds no water whatsoever. But what we are seeing really is an attempt to supplant British identity and British culture. We've gone from the general erosion of British identity through the long march through institutions to this direct onslaught. And you know, I've seen this before. You know, my own family, the oldest civic statue in Lviv, in former Poland, now Ukraine, was of my ancestor, who commanded the cavalry at the siege of Vienna and stopped the Turks advancing at the gates of Vienna into Europe. That was demolished by the Soviets in 1945. Why? Because they wanted to supplant the existing culture with a new ideology. And we're seeing something that's not dissimilar now.
This is the point, really, isn't it, Claire and Emma? I mean, that, as Rafe just said there, if you see it, or if you think it is a cultural onslaught, which I think, for me, it seemed undoubtedly that it is this speed which I think has bewildered people. I don't know, can you comment on that, Emma? I mean, it seems that suddenly here we are at a time where, for example, HBO are pulling this program, you know, the BBC are pulling that one. Okay, it's statues now, but I mean, you know, how, you know, this is extraordinary. How do you think it has been the case? Why has it been the case that it has been so quick?
What Rafe is describing there, what we're definitely seeing is a sort of authoritarian cultural revolutionary impulse that wants to it isn't intended to particularly target necessarily racists or slave owners. The statue of Robert the Bruce was graffitied, and he died in the 1300s. So I think that what we're actually seeing, and this goes back to the point about the police and Neil Basu and the sort of institutional licensing of what's happening, is that in local authorities, not all of them, and within certain institutions and certain positions of people who are in positions of authority, there is an assumed neutrality about something that is very, very ideological. And the assumption is of this kind of imagined consensus, even though there are quite clearly lots of people who are against this and are opposed to it and feel very angry and very helpless to see their heritage being attacked in this way. And I think the speed of it is definitely something that is clearly very worrying. And people will have a lot of questions about how it was possible for the Mayor of London to turn around this Orwellianly named commission in such a short period of time. I think that it's partly because the path had already been laid, in a sense, because the institutions had already absorbed and accepted this idea of systemic racism, which is a very different idea to discrete acts of racism. It's not part of the civil rights tradition. It's very different from the sort of things that people marched for with Martin Luther King. In systemic racism, the ideologues and academics behind the literature that has influenced this movement, people like Robin DiAngelo, believe that every aspect of our society, our history, our culture, and every white person in the West is complicit in systemic racism. So there is literally nothing that is off the table when it comes to the sorts of things that they might try to attack next. The remit will just get larger and larger and larger. And it started with statues connected with slavery. We've already seen it moving into other areas of cultural life, like television programs. Even Ant and Dec have been done in by this. So I think that the issue is that it's assumed that this very ideological movement is actually, and it is very much infused with ideas that we should be able to disagree with, but it's become very, very high cost to stand out against them, because people don't want to be seen as pro-slavery, even if they're defending the statues sort of on principle.
Claire, if you talk about ideology, I think this is one of the, at the moment, there is the slogan, isn't there, Black Lives Matter, but there is also the organisation Black Lives Matter. And I wonder how many people know what the aims of that organisation are. I mean, I think that, isn't it the case, you think that people are sort of clamouring to support the slogan, but actually pretty ignorant maybe of what the organisation says?
Oh, well, that might be true, but I think that there's a danger here of over-flattering the importance of the organisation with its particularly, as it happens, completely incoherent combination of revolutionary sounding slogans with kind of management woke speak. If you kind of read it, it's kind of got all the kind of diversity buzzwords, and then, occasionally you'll say abolish the police, let's have a revolution. It's a kind of very odd mix. Anyone who's ever been serious about revolutionary politics, which I have been, will know that this wouldn't pass muster at the first year seminar, never mind anywhere else. But you see, what happens is, and I know that there's a kind of trend to say these people, and in fact it's just been said, these people are kind of ideologically marching through the institutions, whereas I see this as an institutional collapse. There is no reason why this particular institution, this particular organization needs to have these things have happened often preemptively. One demonstration in Bristol, which I think was pretty spontaneous and got out of hand, the police standing by and watching it and so on, then as has been indicated, the next minute Fawlty Towers goes, and the whole thing loses any sense of coherence. I think that's important, because you have to know who you're going to, as it were, aim your fire and ire at, and to know who you need to talk to, what the kind of discussion is. Because my greatest concern here is that we end up in a situation where we kind of appear to have, a kind of imagined enemy of Black Lives Matter's organised ideologues on the streets versus, Tommy Robinson's army of thugs on the other side being called down to London to defend statues. Whereas actually the speed with which this has happened is that it hasn't happened quickly so much as it's been happening slowly for the last 10, 12 years. You had me on, Peter, to discuss my book, which is all about exactly these themes 4 years ago. And also, I said then, the students aren't the problem. It's the academics, it's the institutions that almost use the student activists as, to ventriloquize their ideas. Something is rotten at the heart there. That's very worrying. So I just think it's dangerous to over imagine, because it ends up with a kind of conspiracy theory, and people will have read these, that Black Lives Matters have got in their nooks and crannies. I mean, most of the angry young teenagers from Tottenham that were down at the demo on the first week, are standing around as bemused as anyone else, right? I mean, they're not kind of schooled in this stuff. They're not familiar with the critical race theories that kind of lie behind some of this stuff. So let's be cautious about where we kind of, as it were, lay the blame, I think.
I agree with that.
I think actually...
No. And I was
sorry, can Rafe come in first? Sorry, yeah.
And as I said in my earlier comment, we've gone from a gradual erosion over the years to now this full-scale onslaught, and that's because the ground's been set for this conflict. And we've known for a long time about the balance that has been shifted in universities, where it went from a 2-to-1 balance of 2 liberals for every conservative academic to one now where it's 9-to-10 far left compared to everyone conservative in the humanities in Britain and in Canada, for example. And the problem there, I think, really quite clearly, is that no one is actually coming to terms with the fact that the next 10 years are really what counts, because we have a crisis of age in this country, where the divide is so much upon age grounds that if we don't take in any steps at the current time to really address this issue, we're going to see no end to this sort of iconoclasm in the future. And there was this great hope that with Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson, there'd be some effort to reverse the bias that exists within institutions in this country. Yet coronavirus came out of nowhere and seems to have sunk all chances of that happening.
I think it seems to me that obviously the coronavirus has been pretty much sort of like wiped off the headlines for a while. There's no question about that. But I think that what you were alluding to there, and what you're alluding to there about this softness, which of course we've talked about on this program many times. There's been, if you like, a long march, I would say. If you look at the way that the media is treating this now, 2 aspects here. On the one hand, it seems, and I wonder whether you agree with me, that people are clambering on to sort of make a gesture because the price of not doing so is just too high now, right? And similarly, there are worrying things within the media. So, for example, in America, you might have seen editors of newspapers, not least the New York Times, have actually been forced to resign because they let commission certain pieces, as you should do with an opinion, as an opinion editor. But they've actually had to, they've been censored or lost their jobs. It seems that the media is pretty much, sort of as one on this. Would you not say? Emma?
I agree completely, firstly, with everything that Claire just said. And I think, like you say, that I think the issue is that the use of language and the ideology that has a background in some of these particular academic circles has seeped into common use, in particular in institutions, within the civil service, within the police. And like you're saying, especially within the media, there is this sort of censorious streak where we saw the same thing with a guy who worked for a radio Manx radio channel, who also got fired and we've seen also Nigel Farage stepping down from his show at LBC after he compared what quite clearly is a fair comparison in terms of iconoclasm to the sorts of things you see in extremist movements, like with the Taliban, Islamic State, the French Revolution, the Reformation. These are just things that are quite typical of revolutions and cultural revolutions, especially, and activists themselves have used the term cultural revolution. So it doesn't seem that there should be a problem in referring to it as that. I think that it's, as Claire said, it's something that has been going on for a very, very long time, and actually it may have just sort of erupted now, but the groundwork had already been laid for it. And so I think that the thing that really worries me is that it's not possible to actually have a proper, reasonable, honest conversation publicly on mainstream platforms about this, because the cost is, if people see people being fired for raising concerns, people who have used the hashtag All Lives Matter ending up losing their careers over this, then people are going to feel that they can't speak out, and that's a very, very dangerous situation, because it means that what's happening right now could escalate very quickly, and without sort of scaremongering, it is only a very small step from attacking physical objects with that much ire to actually becoming physically violent and having clashes between different communities and raising the tension between those communities. So I think that the censorious tendency in this is the thing that is really most worrying.
Claire, can I just ask you just on a more specific point, how do you account for Boris Johnson's near total absence on this? I mean, today, this morning, just before we came on air, he did actually put a statement out via Twitter. But frankly, people are perplexed utterly that a Prime Minister who's always actually prided himself on his sweep of history, and indeed was a biographer of Churchill, as it happens, has been almost entirely absent. Why is it that our politicians do not feel that they can speak out on what are obviously cultural issues? Because the French do.
So it's one thing you mentioned the coronavirus issue having gone, but one of the things that I was going to say was that I actually think the lockdown partly explains the intensity and speed with which this has happened, because I do think there was a kind of, almost like a kind of cauldron of kind of pent up energy and frustration, which a lot of us feel over a lot of things, and this kind of became a lightning rod. A very real, genuine, terrible thing happened. Then there's demonstrations all over the place, and it's almost like sort of like all the kind of fears and frustrations and worries about mass unemployment and prospects being in decline and so on kind of exploded onto the public scene. So I think it's had an impact on that, but I also think, let's be honest, it's completely disorientated the government. They don't actually know how to relate to the public at the moment because they've sent us home and atomized us. There's no public square in a way. They don't really know who they're talking to or how to talk to people because everything's become a bit distorted. We're not even talking to each other. We've only just been allowed to visit each other's homes, so we're all kind of very living our lives peculiarly via press conferences at 5 o'clock and social media. By the way, of course, I understand that millions of people are going to work. I mean, I do know that, but we have been effectively demobilized as a public. And I do think that's not helped the political class to know how to relate to people. They're not even seeing people. They're kind of getting letters, but there's no sort of they can't just wander through the town and have a chat with people because that's not what you're allowed to do. And there's no one in the town. So that's one thing. The thing that's, so I mean, there's also the potential question of cowardice, by the way, which is in the middle of it all. I mean, if you're going to say it's going to be hard, I mean, I like you have been incredibly concerned about this slightly new, although not that new, but a recent turn in media circles, which is to try and get people sacked, your colleagues sacked. A lot of the sackings have actually come from within. That's happened in the New York Times, but I've watched it happen on social media here of people calling upon other Times journalists to try and, get the editors of the editor of the Times to sack, Melanie Phillips. I'm frightened to say it in case it makes it worse. You know what I mean? Actually, it appears that there was an element of that in the LBC decision in relation to Nigel Farage. Certainly, there's been this, we as staff at LBC have had to put up with this for far too long. We didn't ever want him in. It's like a kind of, I mean, first of all, it doesn't indicate much in the way of solidarity. I don't care whether you like someone or not, especially on a talk radio program where people are often employed because they've got controversial views. I mean, and to have a diversity of views. But there's something of that McCarthyite atmosphere that is frightening. And you can see that people are nervous. I mean, I'll be honest, I am nervous about being on this. This will be clipped. This can go out. It's not straightforward who is going to be cancelled next or what for. It's not, it's no longer sufficient to say, but I'm an anti-racist. I mean, that's not going to wash, right? I'm a white woman, and I can be cast in the shadow of far right and so on. Just one small thing. One of the things I'm worried about is the demonization of all sides. And one of the most galling things that I've found from the government is they've, on the one hand, absented themselves and not just involve themselves in a proper discussion about cultural icons. And I don't think that necessarily I want every statue to be there forever, and I would never imagine a statue ever going, but that's a debate, it's a discussion. You could have that discussion, and that's the kind of thing that you can do. They haven't done that. But what when they're trying to look like they're asserting authority, they then have become quite authoritarian. So they say, you know, there's going to be summary justice. Everyone's going to be in prison after 24 hours, right? Which is a bit nerve-wracking, you know. Or are we going to? That's the protesters. You know, the police stand by and let people, you know, jump all over the statue and bash it and drag it through streets and throw it in the river, and this kind of absolute frenzy, kind of watch on, and then say we're proud of the day's work we did in Bristol.
Mhm.
But then the next minute you've got Priti Patel saying we're going to round up the perpetrators and they're going to be shown no mercy. And my concern here is that you end up demonizing young protesters, often young black protesters, as they're all part of some thug gang over there. And what I, you know, and the conversely, as we know, Sadiq Khan, anyone who comes to London to want to protect a statue is inevitably only coming because they're a fascist supporter of Tommy Robinson, the misuse of the term fascism. But, you know, everyone's kind of, and actually lots of people seem to want to come to London on Saturday because they want to show that they don't want, that there's a vacuum at the heart of it all. And I'm worried about both sides being demonized. And somebody like Tommy Robinson, God, I wish I hadn't said his name so often, but he's actually, again, been over flattered as the catalyst of people coming to London tomorrow. He is not the catalyst. He's an opportunistic, you know, person who doesn't give a damn, as far as I can see, who's jumped on this, but can take credit because nobody else will take a lead. And that does frighten me because it does then pit people against each other in a very extreme and polarised fashion that's unhelpful.
And the silence of Boris Johnson and of the government and of the cowardice which is really emanating itself through our media too, really basically plays into the hands of the Black Lives Matter coordinators and Antifa, who are basically engaging in old tactics of using the mob to test how far they can push this. And when you're seeing no defence made by Boris Johnson, who really should be the person of the hour, he wants to put himself as a Churchillian patriotic figure, and yet nowhere are we seeing any great celebration of the fact that it was Britain that ended the slave trade, for example, that it was the Royal Navy that enforced the end to slavery, including having the right to occupy and seize American ships, for example, and indeed defending the right that, if or to use Harold Macmillan, you've never had it so good if you're black. There's nowhere in the world you really want to be apart from being somewhere like Britain, and nowhere are you seeing this great defence and promotion of what Britain has managed to achieve in this country.
I want to sort of just go on a bit actually with this situation, which seems to be sort of spreading out. Where in fact do you think it could go? Where are we actually going to go from here? I mean, to take one example, how I've been viewing it, Baden-Powell, is sort of under attack. We're not quite sure whether his statue is going to go or not. It seems to be a bit confusing. But isn't it, to use the logic of this movement, wouldn't it be, you could see, the scouting movement itself was born in a time of imperialism, etc., etc. So actually, pretty much, why do we have scouts now? We're in a sort of, maybe we're in a kind of revisionist period. This is where I see it sort of going, and it goes on to books. Where do you see it going, Emma?
Well, so I think that this goes back to what we were saying about about TV programs and people being sort of witch hunted by their own colleagues. That what we're doing with historical figures is what has been described as offence archaeology, trying to find problematic things in particular historical figures. And history is messy. No person is either good or completely definitively evil. People have done bad things, they've done good things as well. You can criticize Nelson, but he still was a naval genius. You can criticize Baden-Powell for his opinions about certain things, but the Scout movement is certainly a good thing that should be celebrated. And we shouldn't deny the fact that he was involved in its founding. And I think the problem is that once you start doing this, there actually isn't an end point. What do? Are you going to pull down the pyramids and demolish the whole of Greenwich? Are we going to demolish entire cities that were built off of the money that came from slavery? One example, good example of this, I think, is Thomas Guy. They're taking his statue down. In fact, they boarded it up today outside of Guy's hospital. Right? Yeah, so are they going to rename the hospital? Are they going to tear down the hospital? That's a revisionism and an erasure of history. And if you just to speak about Thomas Guy specifically, he invested in the South Sea Company that was involved in the trafficking of slaves. But he was an investor in all sorts of different companies. He was a bookseller, and he made an awful lot of money. But then if you look at any wealthy figure from that period of time, slavery was part of the economy. So it's going to be very difficult to detach anybody that built anything from the 16th century to the 18th century who wasn't involved in something that today we would call problematic. We can't just erase the 16th to 18th century of British history because there are some things that certain people did that we don't like. And now we see them attacking people like Robert Bruce. We see them attacking statues of Queen Victoria, and all of these people have very complicated histories. And I think what's very concerning is that you have people like the deputy mayor, who is the co-chair of this commission that Sadiq Khan has set up, celebrating Milligan's statue being taken down from outside of the Docklands Museum. So she's the co-chair of this commission, and she's celebrating the fact that it was removed with what looks like very little due process or debate, even though some people may have objected to it. He was outside of a museum. He could have been easily contextualized with more information. So I think what we actually need is more history in the public space, not less. What we're doing by removing statues is just removing our sense of historical perspective or our ability to meet our history in the streets, which I think is something very fundamental, that no generation, individual, commission, politician has the right to remove those things from our memory and our physical space. And I think that's something that's very, very worrying. And I actually think that a lack of historical perspective is what has resulted in this in the first place, because people aren't properly educated about complexity of history. And people have this idea that people are either diabolical or saintly. And speaking of saints, actually, Saint Boniface's statue was defaced in Greenwich with anti-Christian graffiti. They're actually defacing saints, it seems now. I don't know whether or not that was related, but there's some suggestion that it was to do with anarchists. So I think that searching for things that are problematic in historical figures will literally lead to the potential destruction of absolutely anything and everything that people find a little bit distasteful.
And one has to ask, what value is there in destroying and pulling down such statues in terms of black lives? How many black lives are actually going to be saved through this process? Certainly, if Black Lives Matter, why are there no howls of protest over the number of black-on-black killings in South London? Where are the great marches and protests there? You know, in America, in the last 40 years, over 90% of black African Americans who've died have died at the hands of other African Americans. Now, it's fine to protest on this issue if there's some consistency, and if black lives do matter, why is there no similar howl of outrage at that decimation of the black population, or indeed modern slavery? I mean, this is another issue that no one seems to address, is the fact that there are 12 to 15 million Africans who were transported to America in the slave trade, and yet there are approximately 40 million slaves alive today in the world, and 7 in every 1,000 Africans are believed to be in slavery currently. So where are the great protests outside the Nigerian embassy or the embassy of Congo? Nowhere are they to be seen. You have Sadiq Khan declaring last year that he was in favour of a slavery museum in Britain, and that Britain had to live up to it, had to stand up and recognise its role in the slave trade. And yet, you know, he would have repetitive strain injury from saying that he was the son of a Pakistani bus driver, and yet even when he made an official visit to Pakistan, not once has he ever actually called Pakistan out for being one of the worst countries in the world for modern day slavery, where there are over 3 million people living in slavery in modern day Pakistan. And surely it's the lives of people today that count for a lot more, when they can actually be freed and the yoke can be removed from them, rather than revisiting questionable people from the past, most of whom no one's ever heard of. You know, I'm a historian, I don't really know much about Coulson at all, you know, most people don't, and yet they're being whipped up by this organisation. And so one has to question the motives of an organisation called Black Lives Matter when they seem to be more interested in stone than actual lives.
Claire, where do you see it going?
Yeah, so not positively, but there's so much still untangled. But I think that point about what about today's contemporary issues is right. I think one of the issues here is that Black Lives Matters is a bit of a kind of free-floating amorphous hashtag, rather than it. That's why I was trying to say, don't overthink it's an ideology. It's not quite as simple as that. And actually, if you actually ask activists, you know, what is it directly that you want? You know, it'll be things like you have to have a black square on your Instagram, You know, it's like, what's that got to do with anything? You know what I mean? You've got to, you know, you as a, you know, what white people have got to admit their complicity. You know, it's not always concrete. I mean, in America, there's kind of demands to defund the police, but nobody seems to even understand what that means. In the UK's terms, because it's not clear what, you know, it's kind of, what is it you're demanding, right? And for me, I was horrified by the scandal around Windrush. And there was one Black Lives Matters demonstration during the week, which actually was a Windrush demo, which was perfectly legitimate to me. I mean, it seemed to me the British state made an absolute disastrous error at the expense of British citizens who didn't do the filing of their paperwork, okay, and then were treated like, you know, in the worst possible way. That would make me go out on a demo, right? That's infuriatingly terrible. But that's not actually the focus. It's the statues, you know, it's these kind of, so in other words, what's interesting to me is that Black Lives Matter doesn't appear to have a sense of what it stands for or what it wants positively, as it were. What do you want? And the museums question is fascinating, you know, because I think Owen Jones has got an article in The Guardian. He says this is a massive history lesson for the nation. We can all learn something. And you think, well, why don't you write a book? Well, why don't somebody read a book? You know what I mean? You don't have to go around taking down statues in order to have a sense of history. But if you, when people say, well, we should contextualize them and put them into museums, it means they haven't been paying attention to what's happening in museums, because museums are now run by people who hate historical artifacts and are spending the whole time sending them back, hiding them, putting up plaques. I mean, you know, you wouldn't last any longer in a museum than you would on a plinth at the moment. So it's almost, that's why I'm saying it's a kind of cultural crisis. I'm not a great fan of British exceptionalism. You know, Britain led the way on fighting injustice. I mean, Britain was an imperialist colonial power with blood all over its hands. But I'm not, but you know, that was the past. And you have to, if you're involved in politics, believe that things can improve. Right? I happen to think that things have improved from attitudes on race from the 19th century. Actually, they've improved in my lifetime in terms of attitudes on race since the 1970s, 1980s, where actually people were, you know, not just people, but the police actually were much more explicitly, openly, racially harassed young black people in areas where I lived. The reason I'm saying that is because I absolutely agree that history is complicated. So what we don't want to do is emulate the worst aspects of something like the Black Lives Matters or the race theorist simplifying of history, that he is a slave owner, he is bad, by having a we are Britain, we are great. You know, that doesn't make, I mean, it's like the people who sort of say, what about the Engels statue in Manchester then? He's a bad person, he's a communist, pull that down. It's like, we don't want anyone pulling anything down.
Yeah.
We don't want to have a competition between oversimplifying narratives on history or which people should be dumped in the river. Where will it end? Funnily enough, this is just where you just know it's got nothing to do with history. First of all, a school has renamed Rowling House because J.K. Rowling, so this is now suddenly not Black Lives Matter, it's to do with the trans wars and the turf wars, as they're called. And a school has renamed a house because they can't have a house called J.K. Rowling. I mentioned that because I got sent a couple of emails from different schools in London who are, as we speak, asking the sixth form to rename their houses around, you know, Drake House is going to go in wherever that is, you know, asking students, saying, we feel uncomfortable with the names of the houses. Now, by the time we've had that debate, what this has just happened is that every institution will rename everything and it will become completely meaningless and lose any sense of, nobody will remember why we're renaming them, and there'll be lots of rows over whether that's an appropriate name. And every time you name somebody something, somebody will find out something bad about the person you renamed them at Hall after, and then we'll have to rename it again. So this can run and run and run, but let that run and run and run. Much more important is how we get the debate about the superficiality of this right at the centre of politics, and don't allow anyone to tell us it's just a trivial, silly, campus childish game, which is what people have been telling us when we've tried to warn this was happening. People have just said to me, oh, it's students being students, what's your problem? Well, this is my problem.
I think, where I would have to disagree with you on that point when you say we shouldn't sort of like start taking caricature positions. I find it, I don't really think people are seriously kind of calling out, Britain is the absolute best and all. If anything, I think the whole, narrative of the way British history has been treated over the past 40, 50 years is to actually be very, self-loathing, actually, and basically quite derogatory. I mean, I don't really see that there's been a huge jingoism.
And that's where
I just mean people on our side, Peter. I mean people who I know are worried about this can try and bend the stick too far. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
And where this will end, I mean, we get back again to the march through the institutions, because, I live near the American embassy, so I've seen each one of those marches pass by my balcony, and comparing it to the civil rights movement in America in the 60s, the key difference is the age of the participants, where the age of those participating today is really under 35. And of course you have to wonder, who is educating the next generation of museum curators, the next generation of people in the police force and in government and in academia? It is people on the left who have these agendas to put forward, and that's why I don't think we're going to see an end to this coming anytime soon. You look at people like Neil Ferguson, one of the great historians of our time, unable to get a tenured position in a British university because of having very balanced views on empire. But there needs to be, at this time more than any other, someone to stand up. And I take Claire's point that no country is free from sin at all. Of course not. But it was the case that Britain was the country that led the world in abolishing slavery. It was the Royal Navy that enforced that policy, and including the right to seize foreign ships if they had slaves on them. It was the case that it was Africans who enslaved other Africans. White people never actually made any incursions into the continent of Africa. They were moored off the coast and took prisoners of war. And there were as many slaves held by other Africans as there were being transported across. The Islam was engaged in the slave trade for centuries. That only ended officially in 1900 and continued long after that. Where are the people raising those points? And if you put it into that context, then actually Britain and Europe come out very, very well, in my view.
I think what we could end up, we were talking about where it could go. I don't mean to be flippant here, but obviously there are statues around and about of Wilberforce. Perhaps he will be cancelled as being a white saviour. This is one of the narratives now. That we don't need this because this is now a woke thing, isn't it? Of white saviour. Just to round off, therefore, you wanted to say something, Emma, there?
I just wanted to say that I think actually on that point that in the US they actually did, and part of this I think is to do with historical illiteracy. So they tried to remove. There have been some disputes about the statues of Robert Peel that some people want removing because actually they're confusing Robert Peel with his father, who was anti-abolition. And in the US, they actually did deface a statue of an abolitionist. And I think that it's a really important point back to what Claire said about the naming of schools' houses, that you'll have it named something for 1 week and then someone will find something wrong with that person. And then it will just go on and on and on and on. And it's because it's like the famous saying that like Saturn, revolution devours its own children. And I think that's what we're going to end up with. It was very metaphorical that in the French Revolution, they began by decapitating statues and ended up by decapitating each other between the revolutionaries, with Robespierre ending up being bought by it. And I think it's quite metaphorical that if you saw the statue that fell on a protester in the US when they were trying to pull down one of the statues and actually fell and very badly injured one of the protesters, and it just leaves you thinking, who is going to be the wokes Pierre? Who is going to be the person who ends up sort of almost like we had with certain people who have spoken out about Islamophobia, then ending up being attacked for Islamophobia. Who is the most woke person that you can think of right now that eventually is going to be the person who gets it?
Exactly. I mean, we've seen that in the trans debate, of course, haven't you? We've had people like Jermaine Greer and even, Peter Tatchell and others in terms of Islam and so forth now being basically cannibalized by their own. And unfortunately, there is going to be no end to this. But of course, rather than, historical and cultural relativism is never a good idea. Rather than tear down statues, why not actually propose new statues, propose new heroes? Because we're always going to be re-evaluating and rejudging. And how better than to actually compare and contrast people from today and from the past?
I think that's a very good point, Rafe. Thank you. Look, have to end it there. Sorry, Claire, yes, please.
Just right, no, but because what I was going to say was, I was, I didn't agree with the whole summation that you made earlier about slavery, right? The whole historical account of slavery and who ended it. But what a rich conversation we could have about that. That is fine. That history is always contested, and in a way, those nuances. To go back to what you said, Emma, this is a nuance. This is interesting. This should be what we're having discussions about. Now, were I to imagine that in schools, the renaming of houses, I mean, when I went to school, we never had houses, so I don't even know, but the renaming of whatever they all are, right, that would lead to an open, rich, challenging, lively series of debates about historical figures, then I wouldn't object. But we all know that's not what's true, because as soon as you try and raise a question about whether what happened in Bristol was correct, you're accused of being an apologist for slavery. It's like, don't be ridiculous. I mean, it's a low bar, isn't it? Am I a good, virtuous person in 2020 because I condemn slavery and the slave trade? Well, God, you don't have to make very many moral moves to get there. But you can obviously feel very virtuous by saying, but that what it means is we never have a decent discussion. And I still go back to the fact that, that it wasn't just about George Floyd, but who has remembered him in this? That guy that we watched on film that did spark genuine outrage, even if it's been overly confected in a period of time and kind of gone off into different things. But honestly, I think it's forgotten. It gets forgotten. And so what is most exasperating for me is that this cultural regression actually uses the suffering of contemporary victims of racism or police barbarism or whatever it is, and adopts it and makes it their own. And then the next minute we know, and this is something that I would say as a lefty, because it's been said about the left, that every capitalist corporation has been at the forefront of adopting Black Lives Matter's insignia, going around policing the behaviour of their employees, making donations. I mean, absolutely hopeless and dangerous when your bosses are shouting at you if you don't put a black square around your Instagram post, which I know has happened in some corporations. That is going on as we speak. So it just seems to me that poor old George Floyd has been used by a whole range of different organisations and individuals for their own ends, and it's got nothing to do with fighting racism.
Absolutely, and I fear that those brands who are doing that are falling into the same trap that media and everyone else fell for in terms of Brexit as well, in terms of misreading what they think is the mood of the land and going with the voice of the vocal minority rather than as G.K. Chesterton for we are the people of England who have not spoken yet. And I fear that the bubbles in London and Edinburgh and elsewhere are actually setting the agenda here when the public as a whole are aghast at what they're seeing.
Well, thank you once again. And thank you, Claire Fox. Thank you, Emma Webb. Thank you, Rafe. And that's it for Counterculture this week, and we will look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.